Today is December 14th, 2022. We are in Sacramento at the home of Les Ochita. My name is Rose Masters. I'm a park ranger at Manzanar National Historic Site, and also here from Manzanar is Sarah Bone, who's on the camera. Today we're going to be doing an oral history interview about Les's life, especially learning a little bit more about his family's incarceration in Jerome, Arkansas, and Gila River, Arizona. Les, the first thing I want to ask is, do we have your permission to record this interview and use it for educational purposes at Manzanar National Historic Site?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Let's start with the most important person in the room, and just if you could tell me, when you were born, what was your full name at birth?
My name's Lester Toshio Ochita.
Do you know if Toshio has a meaning in Japanese?
I've looked it up, and generally, you know, it's a positive thing, but I can't remember the specifics. But yeah, there's a meaning in Japanese.
Something good.
Yeah.
And when and where were you born?
Sacramento, California, July 25th, 1937.
Let's talk about your dad's side of the family first. What is your father's full name?
Father was Harold Yasuji Ochita, and his parents came from Fukuoka area of Japan. And I think my grandfather came first in the late 1890s. I think it was 1893. And then he sent for his wife later, Soyo. And then they were migrant kind of farmers, and then they settled in Florin at some point in the early 1900s.
And can you say, you said your grandma Soyo's name. What was your grandfather's name?
Senosuke.
Okay.
Yeah.
Where was Sanosuke from in Japan?
That Fukuoka area,
Okay.
and that's about all I know. Yeah.
Are you aware of anything about what his family did economically to get by in Japan?
I'm not sure, but I think, you know, they were like a lot of Japanese families, hurting and looking for a better life. But I think some of the Ochitas were in the business of hotels. So I tried to kind of locate them when I went to Japan, and had no luck.
Yeah. So Sanosuke and Soyo end up in the United States. Where did they settle, and what did they do here?
So I think they first were in the Tehama County area near Red Bluff, because my dad was born in Red Bluff. So eventually they, you know, ended up in Florin, and Florin was a very populous area as far as Japanese. And I think I have one map that shows like 250 families that were in the Florin area. So very Japanese. They had their own Buddhist church, their Methodist church, bazaars, and so it was a very active Japanese community for a small area outside of Sacramento, but very much populated by Japanese.
And what do you know about Red Bluff? Were there many other Japanese American families and Japanese immigrants there?
I'm not sure, but, you know, being a kind of a farm community, there were probably, you know, some Japanese in that area.
Yeah, I'm interested to know what drew your grandparents to that area, but...
And being farm laborers, I think, you know, like a lot of Japanese, they were looking for an area where they could do some, you know, migrant farm work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Your father was born in Red Bluff. How old was he when the family moved to Florin?
I think at a pretty young age, I'm not sure specifically, but I know he went to Elk Grove High School and played baseball there. And so all of my uncles all went to Elk Grove High School. And then our family, because we settled in Florin, myself, all my brothers, sister, we all went to Elk Grove High School.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think that I said it because we talked about it beforehand, but could you say on tape your dad's birthday, if you know it, or birth year?
I think he was born in 1905, and I'm not sure if he was born in a hospital or, in those days, it seems like even people my age, they were born with the help of a midwife. But our family, because my dad was doing fairly well as a young man, owning his own produce delivery business. So we were all born in probably Sutter Hospital. Yeah.
But we're not sure about him and his circumstances of birth.
No.
Does your father have brothers and sisters?
So my let's see, he had one, two, three brothers, and didn't have a sister. Yeah.
Okay.
So all boys.
And what are the names of the children in that family from the oldest to the youngest?
So my father had a brother, Yoshio, who was born in Japan, and he came here. And actually, he had one sister that was born in Japan too, and she never came. And then another brother below him was Hitoshi, with the nickname Stogie, because of his something to do with cigars. And then my brother Pedro, again, that name Pedro, Hiroharu was his Japanese name, but he got the name Pedro from his lunchbox that my mother packed for him for high school and grammar school, and it was a box that was a cigar box, Pedro cigars, yeah.
So there was Stogie and Pedro, both named after cigars,
right.
One way or another. That's very funny. Do you happen to know the name of the sister who stayed behind in Japan?
I know I don't know her first name, but she married into a Yonekura family. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And you said that the eldest, Yoshio, was born in Japan. I'm guessing, so I think I was a little confused about your grandparents. That means they were married already in Japan before coming over to the
I
United
think so,
States.
yeah.
Did Yoshio come with them when they first came over to the state?
I think he came later.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. Your father and family moved down to Florin. Could you talk to me about what their business was here in Florin? Not your dad's business, but as he was a child, what your grandparents' business was.
I think they were pretty much just farm laborers. Yeah.
Did they have their own farm, or were they working on other people's farms?
Other people's farms, because there was never an Ochita farm, unlike my mother's side.
And you described Florin as this vibrant Japanese-American community. Could you give a little bit more details about what sort of made Florin the place that it was in terms of community activities and the different families that were here, and what made the place tick, I guess?
So I think, like a lot of migrant families, it's drawn by some community or likeness in their ancestry. So Florin I think it started attracting people, and it just spiraled from that to become that area of 250 Japanese families. And in those days, the Japanese families didn't mix that much with the other communities. And so the Japanese churches, both the Methodist church and the Buddhist church, were kind of the centerpiece of your social life. So they even had, like their own bazaars, dances for the younger people, and it just grew to be and Sacramento was, the kind of the area for shopping, because there was not a lot of stores other than grocery stores and barber shops. That was about it. But everybody went to Sacramento for their, shopping and buying appliances or, So Sacramento was very much a hub for their business needs.
It sounds like the churches are very important in Florin. Do you happen to know when the Methodist Church was established?
I'm not
What year?
sure, but I'm kind of guessing in the 1920s. And my grandfather, I know he was one of the founders of the Methodist Church. And I think I read something in a book where he donated $50, which was a sizable sum in those days for, starting a church. Yeah.
Which grandfather was this who was the founder, helped found that church?
That was Kuzo Tsukamoto.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about that side of your family in just a minute. Was your the Ochita side of the family, did they attend one of the churches in Florin?
The Ochita side was a Buddhist family. And on my mother's side, the Tsukamotos were Methodist. So all of the Ochitas went to the Buddhist church side. But my mother, I guess, had some influence. She was looking more religious. And so my father, decided to raise all the kids as Methodists. So we're all Methodists.
I see. So your mom lured the family over to the Methodist
Right,
church. Yeah.
right.
Let's talk a little bit more about your dad's education. You said he went to Elk Grove High School. What do you know about his hopes and dreams growing up? What he wanted to be or what he wanted to do?
So my dad, graduated from Elk Grove High School, and by the age of 23, he was already the owner of this Northern California Farms Company. And just before we went to camp, my mom said he owned 20 trucks. So he was a pretty successful businessman at a very young age. And I think about before going to the internment camps, our family took vacations in Santa Cruz. We got pictures of family vacations. And I look at some of the pictures. My mom was a very astute creator of photo albums. So I've got all these albums and pictures that my mom put together. And so she was very good at, and being an accountant, I think she was very good at organizing things, and she was very organized. She had, and I looked at my a high school yearbook that a friend gave me recently, 1928 graduate of Elk Grove High School, and I have that annual from the 1928 year when she graduated, and in her senior prophecy, she said she wanted to be an accountant. So that's something I just told you before, but that was my major in college, was accounting, and my older boy is a CPA. He's an accountant too. So it carried over for generations, that kind of accounting background, that we were just pretty organized people.
That's really neat.
Yeah.
Did your father have anything? Did you ever find your father's yearbook from Elk Grove?
Yep.
And does he say what he wanted to be?
So that same person gave me the 23 yearbook of Elk Grove High School. And he has a picture in there where he was a starting shortstop for the baseball team. And he was, even in he was a good baseball player. When we went to the relocation camps, I got some pictures of him as a manager with the Florin baseball team in both the Jerome and Gila camps. Yeah.
That's neat.
And there was nothing in that yearbook that said he had aspirations to be anything, but somehow he got started with that strawberry delivery business, and very successful at age 23. He was president and owner of the company. Yeah.
Was that before he met, or was that before he married your mother, that he started that business?
My mom graduated in 1928. My father graduated in 1923. So 1929 they got married. So that was shortly after my mom graduated.
Okay.
And I think, both of them were pretty smart, and I think they would have been college grads if there was a different era.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So it sounds like right around the year that they got married is the year that your dad also had full ownership of
Yeah.
the business. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
He was already owner of that, yeah.
Okay.
And Mary Tsukamoto, who wrote a book called Justice for All, I think it was, but she wrote that Edith Tsukamoto married a very prominent young businessman in 1929.
He was already known that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about your mom's side of the family now. Could you tell me your mother's full name when she was born?
Edith Hisako Tsukamoto.
Okay. And when and where was she born?
So she was born in Florin, I think, and I'm not sure if she went to a hospital for her birth or could have been midwife. Yeah.
Who were her parents, your grandparents? What were their names?
Her parents were Kuzo Tsukamoto, and the wife, her mother was Ito Tsukamoto. Yeah.
What do you know about their respective stories in Japan before immigrating to the U.S.?
So Kuzo Tsukamoto was one of the first ones to, I think, Japanese people to come to America. I think he had a stop in Hawaii, and then he worked in the kind of logging business and maybe some fishing industry too in the state of Washington. And so somehow he made his way from the state of Washington to Florin. And I remember him telling the family that when he arrived in Florin, his shoes had worn through and he had newspaper stuck in his shoe to give him some kind of a sole. So so I think he was probably just a migrant farm worker too, but he was one of the first landowners in Florin, and he had to sign up the property in the name of his son. But he had a successful, I think he had 2 farms, and one he sold to get funding for his stepson who started a store in LA. But the other farm was, run by Iwao L. Tsukamoto, who was my uncle, and 40 acres that he had raised strawberries, grapes, persimmon, quince, and they lived off the land because I remember they had chickens on the farm. My grandfather raised tea that he sold in the Sacramento Japanese grocery store. So they were pretty darn successful and raised their family on through the farm's earnings.
Yeah. Wow. Are you aware what year he arrived in Florin?
I know he left Japan in the late 1890s, so one of the first migrants, and so 1890s, and I think about that year. General Custer's last stand was 1876, so it wasn't that much later than the Custer's last stand that he arrived in America.
Where was he from in Japan?
He was from the Hiroshima area, as opposed to my father's side from Fukuoka. Okay. So both those areas were areas that a lot of Japanese migrants came from, especially Hiroshima.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Are you aware why so many people migrated from Hiroshima?
I think the southern part of Japan, where both Hiroshima and Fukuoka are, I think they were areas that were economically hurting. And I don't hear about too many Japanese that came from like Tokyo, further north, because I think Tokyo was a thriving area. But Hiroshima and Fukuoka were both areas I think that were economically hurting. Mm-hmm. And people were just seeking a better life, and they've heard about the opportunities. And both North America and South America, and I went on a vacation to South America, and it was very interesting to hear that 1.6 million Japanese had immigrated from Japan to South America, and especially Brazil. Whereas maybe not even close to that amount, but still a sizable number came to North America. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's a part of the history we don't hear about a lot, but
South America,
Yeah.
yeah, it was very.
yeah. What did Kuzo's family in Japan do for a living?
I have no idea.
Okay. Yeah, so just thought I would ask in case that ended up coming down to your
Yeah.
family history.
But I'm just guessing they might have been farmers too, because Kuzo was very proficient and became a successful farmer.
Yeah, it sounds like he maybe had those skills
Yeah.
when he came over.
Right.
And do you know anything about your grandmother Ito's family circumstances in Japan?
Nothing.
Okay.
Yeah.
How did the two of them come to be married to each other? Did they ever share that with you?
So they were, already married, not like a picture bride. That a lot of Japanese men that came over early, they didn't have wives, and they married pictures.
But not those two.
No.
Then. They were already married in
Yep.
Japan.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that I saw their names were right next to each other on some of those early records we were looking
Right.
at. Yeah. So your mom, does she have siblings? And if I know we've talked about them already. If you could name your mother's siblings from the eldest to the youngest.
So her older sister was Margaret, and then right below her, I think, was Alfred Iwao, and then the youngest sister was Nami. Yeah.
Okay. And so your mom was right between Margaret and Alfred
Right.
Iwao.
Yeah.
And is Iwao, is that who married Mary
Right.
Tsukamoto? Okay.
Right.
Got it.
And they had one daughter, Mariel.
Okay. What did your mother tell you about her childhood growing up in Florin? What was it like to grow up here?
I didn't hear a lot of that. So they already had that farm, and I think they were just living a pretty simple farm life, with the Methodist Church being the hub of their social life. But I didn't hear that many stories about their childhood.
That's okay. We know that she wanted to be an accountant.
Right.
Yeah, that tells us something. We have a bit of possibly lawnmower noise right outside during our interview.
Right.
Just letting that be known for the future who watches this movie. Could you tell me how your parents came to meet each other?
Well, I think, again, that social life in Florin was very much a Japanese-oriented community and social life. So I think, I look at, that's their wedding picture.
Oh my gosh. We're going to let Sarah catch that on the camera.
Oh, okay.
That's a beautiful photograph. Look at her headdress.
Did you get it?
Wow.
But this is my mom's album.
Uh-huh.
There's my mom and dad.
Wow.
Hold on, I'm gonna get them to look at them.
So I think my dad had pretty good taste, and he spotted my mom and said, "Hey, I want to take her out." Yeah.
Do you know if they had a baishakunin?
I don't think so.
It was just your dad seeing a pretty woman. And
Yeah, and I think he just.
Okay. Did they go to high? They wouldn't have gone to high school together then, because the age difference was
Right.
a little bit too
Yeah.
wide. Okay.
He graduated in 23 and she in 28.
28. Okay.
So
it's
5-year difference.
years.
So I think they didn't overlap, yeah, in high school.
Okay.
And there's another picture, these old pictures that people used to take in the old days that were
Yeah.
panoramic.
Yeah.
I'm gonna zoom in and panorama it, so hold on a second.
Okay, but that's their wedding picture with panoramic picture.
And is this the Methodist church that's behind them?
That is
Okay.
in Florin, and that building is still there.
Is it really? And so your grandfather, Kuzo, helped found that church
Right.
then? Okay.
Yep.
I have a few more questions about that after Sarah's done this.
I gotta get to the end of the
Pan.
panorama
Wow.
with the car.
There
You
you
know,
go.
these pictures were very
Okay.
popular in the old
Okay.
days, but I don't see panoramic pictures being taken like this anymore.
Not like that. I think she got the
Yeah,
whole
I got
thing.
it.
Okay.
So you said that your mother sort of brought your dad over into the Methodist church. How did your grandfather become Methodist?
You know, I don't think he was as near as religious as my mother. So, but he accepted the fact that the kids were going to go to the Methodist church, yeah, and become baptized and etc. You know, but I'm not sure if he ever got baptized. He might have in his later years.
Are we? Let me make sure we're taking. I was talking about Kuzo
Oh, Kuzo.
Tsukamoto. Yeah.
Oh,
How- Do you know how he became Christian? If that was
No.
in Japan or if it was after he immigrated?
I'm not sure. Because I think it was a very small percentage of Japanese in Japan that were Christian.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if he was Christian before or after.
All right.
And, you know, our Reverend Hanaoka that lives in San Francisco now, former Reverend at our Methodist church here, he was telling me that his family was Buddhist and the family lived in Hiroshima. And the family was affected by the atomic bomb. And he said he became a Christian because the closest church was a Christian church. And his older sister started taking him to the Christian church. So it could be, you know, any story like that, so if my grandfather became a Christian in Japan, it could have been somebody taking him to a Christian church. Or else maybe he was like my mom. He married a Christian.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Lots of little ways those things
Yeah.
happen. On the Ochida side of the family, did they attend the Buddhist church weekly, or was it something that was a big part of their lives, or?
I'm not sure about weekly or what, but the
Yeah.
Ochida family was Buddhist. And I know I have pictures of my Uncle Stogie. His wedding is at the Florin Buddhist Church.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. You said your parents married in 1929. Do you know the date that they married?
No, I
That's
think
okay.
I think I might have it in one of my records. Yeah,
It's okay. I'm asking you a lot of those little detailed questions.
it might
and
be
you know.
in that memoirs that I wrote. You know,
We'll look it up,
It might
yeah.
be in there. Yeah.
Yeah. Who was their first child?
Ken.
And when was Ken born?
So, I'm guessing he was probably about 6 years younger than me. So maybe 1930 or around there. Yeah.
Did Ken have a Japanese name also when he was born?
Kenneth Akio.
And who came after him?
So it was Lucille, and she never had a Japanese name.
And then who's after Lucille?
Earl Haru. Yeah.
And then I think I know who's next, but why don't you tell us
Yeah.
who's next?
So
in
my
line?
name is Lester Toshio, and below me is Harold Yasuo. He passed away.
Okay. Okay. And
And then my youngest brother, who was born after the relocation camp, his name is Wayne Yukio.
what year was Wayne born?
Let's see. It was when I was in the 8th grade. That's all I remember. So he's 13 years younger than me. So
Okay, we'll figure it out.
yeah, I had
Yeah.
13 to 37. So
Yeah. By the time Kenneth is born, it sounds like your dad is already successful in his business.
Yeah.
Could you take a few moments to tell us about that business, what it was?
So my dad, as I mentioned, he had 20 trucks by the time of the interment. But with the trucks, they went out to the farms, picked up strawberries and some grapes, and then they brought it back to our central shed. And my dad was doing the contacts with the local grocery stores like Safeway, etc., and they would deliver the strawberries and grapes to the stores in Sacramento mainly, and probably some in the Elk Grove area or maybe Galt or whatever. But for the most part, the deliveries were to the Sacramento area. And then his business was, he rented the building that was owned by the Southern Pacific Railroad. So they had a train station there, and he would ship out strawberries to outlying areas through the trains. And I remember after the war, there were even some of the deliveries where the strawberries were taken to the Sacramento airport, and they were shipping out by air strawberries even. Yeah.
Wow. So were the majority of farms in this area berry farms?
Yeah, for the most part, yeah.
And would that have been just strawberries or other kinds as
Strawberries and grapes. Yeah.
Sarah, how loud is that on the headphones?
It's loud, but I can hear you two very well.
Should we pause just one
Maybe
second
we'll
while
just
it's
give
right
it a
Okay.
here?
pause,
Yeah. We're back after a short and enjoyable break, waiting for the person to stop mowing the lawn next door. Les, you were just telling us about your father's business, and you said that he helped get the berries from all the farms into the Sacramento grocery stores and that kind of thing.
Right.
Which sounds like a very large business. Are you aware of how many people were working for him at
Well,
the time?
I just think about he had like a chief accountant, and then my mother was an accountant too, and then he had an office manager, and then with 20 trucks, he had to have at the peak 20 drivers. So quite a few people.
Yeah, and I wonder who was loading all the berries also into the trucks, if that was.
So when you go out to a farm, the driver and the farmer would load the truck. And then when he came back, the office workers and they would just have to unload, but help each other as far as the trucks coming in.
Was this something that was going on daily, every single day? Going on?
Yep.
Okay.
In fact, I think it was 7 days a week. Yeah. Strawberries are very, they don't hold up very much, so you got to get it out right away. So there was a lot of pressure to sell it too, because it's a very vulnerable fruit. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it won't last
Yeah,
too long. Sure.
right.
Is there anything else about your father's business that I maybe don't know to ask about, but that you would like to share?
I think, kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but I mentioned that he had 20 trucks before internment. When we got back, a lot of people had lost their farms, couldn't pay the taxes or whatever, and so the business was not what it was before. He started out with 2 trucks, I remember, an old Army truck and an International panel. And I think he maybe grew it to be maybe 9 or 10 trucks. But it was nothing like he had before. So I think about what the internment did to people financially. And my dad, I think, really suffered a lot as far as what he could have possibly had.
Yeah, that sounds like a giant loss.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're going to talk about right after the war and, your family trying to get back on its feet
Yeah.
in a little bit. Would you be willing to describe the house that you lived in when you were growing up? Yeah.
So, fortunately, when we were interned, we had a neighbor, Mary McCumber, very close friend, and she used to come over every evening. And you know how Japanese like white rice. She'd come over every night because she would want to eat her rice with sugar and cream. But Mary was a good friend of my dad's, and she rented out the house for the 3.5 years we were away. So we had a house to come back to. And it was, you know, a nice house for that day. Indoor plumbing like a lot of farmers didn't have. And we had a dining room, a living room, and a couple of bedrooms. And one bedroom, I remember me and 3 brothers, had 2 double beds in the bedroom, so we had 4 of us in one room, but it was still, you know, a decent place to live. Yeah.
Where was that in Florin?
Right near the railroad tracks, and it was right in the middle of town. Yeah.
Is it still there?
Unfortunately, I used to drive by there and just drive into that Macomber Street and look at the house every once in a while, but maybe about 5-6 years ago it was torn down. So it's kind of sad to see the house go.
When you look back in your mind, what is the very first memory that you have of anything?
You know, I can just barely remember pre-war, nothing. But I can remember being on a train when we left and went from the Fresno Assembly Center to Arkansas, Jerome, Arkansas. So not a whole lot, but I just remember that train ride because it's the first time I'd been on a train. And then as far as the camp life, because I was maybe 4.5 or 5 when I went in, I remember kindergarten. So starting kindergarten in Jerome, Arkansas. But not a whole lot about the camp life. I remember the men going out to chop wood for firewood during the winter. And then leaving Jerome, we went to Gila for the last 1.5 years. And so from the swamplands of Arkansas, we went to the desert south of Phoenix. And I remember going to see baseball games with the Japanese teams. You know, we had teams. Remember a little bit about the food, Spam, rice balls, and I remember an ice cream truck came into the camp once, and we didn't have ice cream in the camps, but I remember standing in line in 110-degree weather for a single ice cream cone, and that was really a treat to get an ice cream cone. Yeah.
I bet that was a big line.
Yeah. And then the other thing I kind of remember about the camp was my uncle, who had, this is Mariel's father, he had gotten a job as a cook in Michigan at a girls' school. So he had somehow gotten my father's car, a 41 Dodge, which was pretty new then. So he got it somehow to Michigan. So when he was released, when the Japanese were being released from the camps, he was already in Michigan, out of the camp. So he drove with Aunt Mary and Mariel, and they came to the Gila camp. And I still remember he took us to Phoenix, and it's the first time I saw a movie indoors, because we used to watch the movies on the side of a mountain. And then he took us to a soda fountain, and I remember having a chocolate sundae. And so it was really a treat to see an indoor movie. And then coming back from Gila, we got on the Greyhound bus. And I don't remember, but I guess every person was given $25. And so we were coming back to Florin and down the old 99, because there was no I-5 then, and Stockton Boulevard, where the Costco is now, and that was the main highway, Highway 99. And I still remember when the Greyhound bus stopped at Florin Road, and people saw the sign, Florin Road, and I remember the women started crying because they were home after 3.5 years. That's something that's, you know, I was only 8.5, but I just remember it's spontaneous. The women started crying because they were home.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. I have a lot of questions about all the years that we just covered, if that's okay. That was a very good summary, though. Thank you. Do you know if before World War II, your older siblings attended Japanese school?
You know, for some reason, a lot of Japanese people did send their kids to Japanese school because it was, I think, but I think my parents were very Americanized. And I think they had kind of a desire for us to speak English as good as possible and become very Americanized. So none of us went to Japanese school. Interesting.
Yeah, I was curious because you're one of the older sanseis that
Yeah.
I've ever interviewed. And your oldest brother would have been maybe one of the oldest sanseis I would have ever met
Yeah.
if I'd gotten to meet him. And so your parents as Nisei, do you know if they went to Japanese school
I'm not sure.
when they were growing up?
I'm not sure.
They didn't share that with you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
And then
go ahead.
I think about my parents spoke very little Japanese too. You know, I think about my dad playing baseball for Elk Grove High. My mom was, my Aunt Mary told me that she was the first student body officer in being Japanese. So she was a student council treasurer. So again, the accounting thing. But so I think they were pretty Americanized. And, you know, my dad did, even his business, he had to do a lot of interaction with the food and ag inspectors, the salespeople for Safeway or whatever. So he was, I don't remember him speaking that much Japanese. And he could, I think he could understand, you know, because of his Issei parents. But I don't remember my dad and mom speak very, very little Japanese.
Your
yeah.
grandparents, what languages did they speak?
Japanese.
And were you able to talk with them?
You know, I think as a kid even, I was maybe more interested than my brothers as far as trying to get in and listen in on conversations. So even when my grandparents or family friends that were older were speaking Japanese, I would try to comprehend. So my Japanese is not good, but, you know, I have a little bit of a knowledge of it. And I still remember evidence that it's not that good is that my first trip to Japan, I went to a food booth in a railroad station in Japan, and I tried to speak some Japanese to the women that were behind the counter there. And one woman started laughing so much, she had tears coming out of her eyes with my Japanese.
I bet that made you feel good.
She had to sit on the floor, and her friends were saying, "Get up, get up."
Oh my goodness. Okay. What holidays did your family celebrate, or even did the town of Florence celebrate?
You know, I think about the bazaars were kind of a big thing, especially with the Buddhists, you know, because maybe the Buddhists don't celebrate the Christian holidays even as much as Christians, but Christmas was just, to me, I don't know if you noticed my Christmas tree, but I've always loved, and my dad, I remember he used to love putting up a tree too, and he used to hang the tinsels one by one. So I just love Christmas, and my wife is Buddhist too, so maybe Christmas doesn't mean quite as much to her, but I just like, you know, you have gifts that are not expensive or anything, but just to have things to open, and a lot of it could be even funny, you know, things, but I just really enjoy Christmas, but, you know, Easter, Thanksgiving, all the holidays are really nice.
Were there big like New Year's Eve celebrations in Florin, you know, as a Japanese American community?
I don't remember New Year's Eve as
Or
much
New
as
Year's, sorry.
New Year's
Yeah,
Day.
Yeah, sorry, that's what I meant
Yeah.
to say. Yeah.
So that's kind of a thing that's died, I think, from what I talk to people today. But in the old days, the women had to prepare just a banquet almost, you know, because the men made their rounds with a caravan of cars. They went from home to home, and they had a designated driver because they would drink at every. But the women had to provide a feast for the traveling men.
Yeah. A lot of work for the women.
It was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did that take place in Florence?
Oh,
Was
yeah.
that a big deal?
Oh, yeah.
That made me curious about when you look at your mom and your dad who were co-running this business, what kind of sort of relationship did they have from a child's eyes? What was their, like, were they well matched to each other from your perspective?
Good question, because I always think about that, and I think I never heard words of anger between the two. So I think there was just a great deal of respect. And you know what I told you about my dad after coming back, the business was not as good as it could have been. I think that had an impact on him, and he started drinking really heavily. He was going to AA meetings, but I never heard my mom complain about even his drinking. I think she just understood, you know, what had happened to his life from what it could have been, and so I think they were really a good match. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Could you share with us what your mom's personality was like?
You know, she was, like I was saying, you know, the accounting desire that she had in high school, and she was a pretty organized person, a great cook, knew where everything in the house was. If something was missing, she knew where it was. And I have a niece that married, I mean, you know, she made her first girl child, Edith, after my mom. So I think even people in our family, they kind of really had a great amount of respect for my mom. Yeah.
What was your dad's personality like?
You know, like being a businessman and doing very well at age 23, you know, he was very good at his business. And I think about, you know, he didn't dictate a lot of things, but I really had a lot of respect for him. And even with that drinking thing, he was always a very honest, kind man. And I told you when he was doing well, he's paid for my grandparents' trip to Japan. And we always had a lot of people come to our house for dinners. And so I think he shared his, you know, good fortune with a lot of people. But I remember he wanted us to do things right, like be neat, be honest. And I remember he used to say things like, don't procrastinate. And maybe I shouldn't say this, but he said, mañana is for Mexicans. Maybe a little bit racial, but that was kind of funny. And then he also said, try to be more than mediocre. But kind of good words of advice. Try to do well, you know, yeah.
Yeah. Were there values that your mom tried to instill in you that were different from your dad?
Well, I think just the way she conducted herself, and you know, just without saying as many words as my dad, you just kind of took in what she was and said, "Hey, you know, it was good quality." So, yeah.
Be like mom.
Oh yeah.
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 I know that you said. Well, let me ask Sarah real quick. Do you have any pre-war? Okay. You had said that you don't have a lot of memories before that train ride. Were there stories that your family shared with you of their memories of the day that the Japanese military attacked Pearl Harbor?
I can't remember anything about the reaction of our family or people talking about it. Of course, I was 5 years old, so maybe my oldest brother might know more about it. But I think about the pre-internment years.
Yeah.
So I took out this picture that I have in my living room. But
Oh, wow.
if you look at that picture,
That's your family?
that's my family.
Wow.
So I think about this picture and my dad doing pretty well, and to be able to go to a professional photographer and having pretty nice clothes for the portrait here. You know, it kind of, this picture to me is indicative of how he was doing well in his business.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a beautiful family portrait. Would you be willing to point out who is who in this picture?
Sure. So my dad and mom, of course,
Yeah.
my oldest brother Ken, my sister Lucille, the next brother is Earl, me, and then my younger brother then, Sonny, but Wayne was born after camp.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that is indicative of a family that's doing well. It helps show what was lost, I
Yeah.
think. And yeah. Your dad, something I meant to ask, you know, before this interview, we looked at a lot of the newspapers from the camps, and it shows that he was very involved in the community in the camps. Was he very involved in the Florin community as well, outside of his business?
Yeah, you know, I still remember. Did I tell you about my new minister that had come to the Florin Japanese Methodist Church? And he was telling me that when he first arrived, he asked some people in the church, I've got to know the community and what goes on here and meet more people. And he said this person in his church said, go see Harold Ochita. Because he said, he's like the mayor, Japanese mayor of Florin. Because my dad used to do a lot of the arrangements for funerals and things when people, you know, wouldn't speak very good Japanese and they lost a member of the family or whatever. So I think my dad was kind of very community oriented. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely carried through in
Yeah.
the war years, sure. Were there stories that your family shared with you about how they prepared to leave when they found out they would be forced to leave? You're not sure
No,
how all those
again-
preparations went down?
Right, because
Okay.
again, my age, I don't remember. But I was going to show you this other picture here that
Yeah.
kind of an interesting picture that
You can just hold it right next to you and Sarah can zoom
Okay.
in on it, yeah.
But that picture there was taken by, who's the famous photographer? Dorothea Lange. Dorothea Lange came to Florin in 1942, just before we left for camp. And this picture was taken, and that's me as a 4-year-old with my back turned.
Where are you right in that photograph? Where are you standing? Like, what do you stand? What's the street you're on, and what's
This
going
is
on?
Florin Road.
Okay.
Florin Road, and it's in front of a Japanese grocery store. But I know it's got my brother, my sister, and my kid brother, and my cousins.
Yeah, yeah.
So
And that
Dor-
was right before you
Right.
had to leave.
And Dorothea Lange came to Florin because she was, I think she was actually hired by the federal government to kind of portray a lot of things that happened. And there's other famous photos she's, you know, taken of people during the evacuation. But I was kind of amazed that I found this at the Bancroft Library at UC Davis. I mean,
Yeah.
UC Berkeley.
You're famous. You were-
But to be in a picture taken by Dorothea Lange, you know.
absolutely, absolutely, yeah. You said your family went to the Fresno Assembly Center. Did they tell? I know you said you don't have memories of that place,
No.
but did they tell you anything about what it was like for them?
Well, I've just read things and heard some stories, but one of the sad things about being sent to Fresno was it was the county fairgrounds, San Joaquin County, and people were given burlap sacks to fill with straw, and that was their mattresses, and then people were placed in horse stalls, so the smell of manure was still prevalent in those stalls. So I just think about our family had a nice home, and being subjected to something like that in just a matter of being transported for 200 miles to horse stalls. That's a pretty sad thing.
And your mom had a very young child with Harold.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe I should just ask maybe a general question. Was this period of your family's life something that you ever talked about as a family after the war?
Not a whole lot. And that's a very common thing that I've heard a lot of Japanese people say. They didn't have much discussion with their parents or, siblings or whatever about being interned. And it's a very common thing that people didn't talk about it. Mm-hmm. It was a different time, 1942.
The train ride out to Jerome, Arkansas, what do you remember of it? I know you said it was probably your first memory from your whole life. What does that memory look like when you think of it?
Again, I don't remember other than being on that train. And Mary Tsukamoto's book, Justice for All, she's written a little bit about it. And I think I got the chicken pox or some kind of, and I was quarantined, I think, for a little while in a separate part of the train, I think. But I really don't remember.
Yeah. So you sort of learned about that from reading what she wrote, I see. Yeah. And then in Jerome, Arkansas, do you have any memories of the barracks room that you were in?
Let me just show you something here.
Yeah. I love that this interview comes with archives, and it's wonderful.
This is something that shows Block 9 in Jerome, Arkansas, the block we were in. So it was drawn up by a relative of ours, Dorothy Kawakawa, but she even put the names of every family that was in every part of each barrack.
That is amazing.
Yeah.
Wow. So could you point to where you were? And this is Block 9?
So you see the two yellow
yes.
Yellow highlighting there, that's where our family had, and we were given 2 rooms because of our family size, and then we had our grandfather too.
Yeah.
So I mentioned before that my 2 oldest brothers stayed in a room with my grandfather who had cancer. Mm-hmm. And they just said they remember him just moaning and groaning from pain, and the care was not too good, and he died in Jerome.
Do you have any memories of your grandpa, Sanosuke?
Very little, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he died when you were so young.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did your family talk about what it was like to lose, Dad and Grandpa after all of the hardship already that they'd faced, and then for him to die in Jerome? What was that like?
No, I don't remember any discussion on it.
Yeah, that's okay. Are there other memories of Jerome that you would like to share with us? Oops.
Actually, show you something here that I
sure.
have. Where was it now? Oh, this one right here. I can reach over for it.
You got it?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's a picture of my grandfather's funeral in Jerome, Arkansas.
Wow. Are you in this photograph?
So I'm right there, but again, I was probably 5 or maybe a little over 5.
Mm-hmm. Was this at the Buddhist or the Protestant church? Do you know which, if he had a Buddhist funeral service or?
I'm not sure,
Yeah.
but that was the Ochita side that was Buddhist.
Yes, yeah, okay. And thank you for sharing that. Are there other photos from Jerome that have helped fill in your memories that you would like
Yeah.
to show?
So I was going to show you a few pictures here.
Yeah.
And this one here, you know, I'm a docent at the California State Museum, and I always show this picture. Every year, starting in February for a couple of months, we have mostly school kids come to the museum, and we have a presentation. There's a permanent Japanese American museum internment exhibit there. So they take them through that exhibit, and then they also come upstairs, and I, along with other volunteers, we give a discussion about the internment. And I always like to show this picture to the kids. And sometimes we have adults, teachers, chaperones. But I like to show this picture because it's, to me, a very bittersweet picture in that here we are interned, really imprisoned without due process of law. But every morning we woke up and we raised the American flag. So, you know, kind of ironic that we're being loyal Americans in spite of being locked up by our own country.
That leads me to a question. You had an uncle serving in the military. Could you tell us about his military service? When did he join the military? Was it before World War II, or when did that happen?
Okay, that's his picture, Pedro Ochita Hiroharu, but he was in the U.S. Army already when World War II broke out. And all the Japanese Americans of draft age were classified as 4C, which means you're identified or defined as an enemy alien. So my uncle was already in, he was already in the U.S. Army, and they didn't know what to do with Japanese guys. So he was just put in the holding pattern and probably just doing latrine duty or KP, you know, kitchen duty or whatever. Then in 1940, late 40s, I think, late 43 rather, with the war going on and the U.S. Army seeking to get as many, you know, soldiers as possible with the war in Europe and the Pacific, President Roosevelt authorized the formation of a Japanese American segregated unit. So the Army went to Hawaii, and Hawaii had a very large population of Japanese Americans, and they were not evacuated or put interned. And why? Because 40% of Hawaii's population was Japanese American. Could you take away 40% of the population? They needed the manpower for hospitals or army fields, whatever. So they went to Hawaii, and they formed a single battalion called the 100th. So these guys came to the mainland, trained, and they went to fight in Italy. Fought in a couple of major battles like Anzio, Salerno in Italy, and they were nicknamed the Purple Heart Battalion, which is given to, the Purple Heart Medal is given if a person is wounded or killed. So they suffered such high casualties, they were named the Purple Heart Battalion. So the Army decides, with the kind of record that these guys displayed, let's form a whole regiment now. So they formed the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and my Uncle Pedro was assigned now, because now we have a Japanese American unit. And he went on to fight in Italy, France, got wounded, died with shrapnel, metal shrapnel in his body for the rest of his life. Yeah. So while we're on the topic of the 442nd, I'd like to kind of elaborate on some of the things, because this chart right here.
Oh, hold on one second.
Oops, okay.
Les, let
Yeah.
me get it for you.
I'd like to show this chart to the kids and well, everybody that comes to the museum. Because the 442nd, they became the most decorated unit in the history of the U.S. Army for size and duration. And look at that list of medals. That's pretty darn amazing for a single regiment to get. And if you look at that, 7 medals of honor, the highest medal given by our country. And then the bottom one that has the number of Purple Hearts, they basically had to replenish the unit twice over.
Where was your uncle wounded? Do you know what battle he was fighting in when he was wounded?
I'm pretty sure it was in France. Maybe you could turn that thing around.
Oh.
Yeah, when. Maybe I'll just show this while you have it here. Maybe I'll just kind of jump to this thing here about when we were leaving the relocation camp. My wife and I went to a reunion of Jerome, maybe about a dozen years ago. And when we walked into the large auditorium where the reunion was taking place, my wife says, "Hey, look at that poster they have at the entrance of the," and it was a picture taken by this Charles Mace of our family on a truck. So what a coincidence that picture of our family was at the reunion.
And this is when you were leaving Jerome to go to Gila River?
Right.
That's good, because that's the next thing I wanted to ask you about. So
Okay.
Good segue.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So while we're on the 442nd, I'd like to say a few more things, if I may. There's one major battle called the Battle of the Lost Battalion that the 442 fought in France. And the U.S. Army has designated that battle one of the 10 most significant battles in the history of the U.S. Army. And the reason is, in this battle, a group of Texans had advanced too quickly, and they were entrapped or encircled by the Germans. So it was a desperate situation. So after a couple of days, they were running low on ammunition and food, etc. And a couple of American units from this Texas division that this battalion was assigned to tried to break through, and they were repulsed by the Germans. Then this general said to the 442nd, "We got to break through, so at all costs, break through." And they break through after like 3 or 4 days of fighting. But they saved 211 Texans, but it cost them 800 casualties. So that's been the reason, it wasn't one of the major battles, but just the significance of rescue to rescuers. When the war was over, the Texas people were so appreciative of that. They named all the 442nd veterans honorary Texans. So that was Governor Connolly got that bill passed. So that was neat. And then another thing a Texas story was that there was a street called Jap Alley in Texas, and that's kind of been a derogatory term. And so some Texas Japanese Americans asked the city to change the name of that alley, and they said no, it's historical, and it was not meant in a derogatory sense. The reason it was called Jap Alley was we had some Japanese settlers that built homes on that street, so it was kind of an honorable thing. But when the Texas soldiers who were saved in that Lost Battalion battle heard about it, they went to the city council. Name was changed.
Are these some of the things that you talk about as a volunteer?
Yeah. Because there's other stories too, like little known is the one of the Dachau satellite camps, you know, the German extermination camps, one of the camps, satellite camps, was broken into, and the people's,
Let's pause a second to
Okay.
fix that.
okay? So, you know, I use the word bittersweet because some of the stories about the 442nd are bittersweet. You know, when the Americans liberated Rome, they had a victory march into Rome. The 442nd guys that fought in the liberation were told to stand aside, and they were not allowed to march in the victory parade. I was starting to say about Dachau, one of the satellite camps. The first troops that broke into one of the camps was contingent of the 442nd. That was not publicized at all, and I saw one special on TV where some Jewish survivors said, "Hey, how come there's never mention of those Asian guys that saved us?" So I think there was probably somewhat of a reluctance by the U.S. Army to publicize the 442nd when their relatives are in the internment camps. You know. But President Truman knew about the battle record of the 442. When they returned from Europe, he asked them to march down Constitution Avenue in Washington, D.C., and he had some real nice words for the troops. He said, "You fought not only the enemy, but you fought prejudice, and you're winners." You know. So that was really nice of the president. And then Danny Noy spoke at that Jerome reunion that I went to, and he said that when he returned from Europe and he's making his way back to Hawaii, he stopped at a barber shop in Oakland, California, to look nice for his parents. He walked into the barber shop with his Army uniform, chest full of battle ribbons, captain's bars, because he got commissioned as an officer during the war, and the barber refused to cut his hair, you know. And he asked the barber, what's happened? And he said, "We don't cut Jap hair." So Medal of Honor winner was refused a haircut, you know, because of his race. And the last story I'd like to tell the class is about this Sergeant Kaz Masuda, who was killed in France. When his body was returned to Santa Ana, California, his family wanted the body to be buried in the city cemetery. The city had a clause that Japanese Americans or Asians couldn't be buried. This General Stilwell found out about it, and he got that reversed. And then years later, when that reparations bill was for President Reagan to sign, Mary Masuda, Kaz Masuda's sister, wrote a letter to President Reagan and said, "You spoke as a young captain when my brother's body was given the medal of the Silver Star, I guess it was, or no, Distinguished Service Cross, second highest medal. And you spoke and you had some very nice words, you know." And she said, "When I speak at the Kazuo Masuda school in Santa Ana that is named after him, I always tell the class about your nice words for my brother." And she said, she closed her letter by something to the effect of, "You were a great American that day. Would you be a great American again and sign our reparations bill?" And there's some stories that Reagan said, "I remember that day." And that letter from Masuda's sister might have been the camel that broke the, straw that broke the camel's back, but Reagan signed the bill, you know. So I always think about the 442 and, what they did for, in essence, for the whole Japanese community by their bravery, yeah.
Les, what inspired you to want to share the stories of the 442 as a volunteer?
Well, I've always been like history, and I've loved, I guess, living in that time of World War II, and then being proud of my uncle you know, joining the 442, and then reading about their, you know, valor, and so it's been a very inspiring thing, because I think they did so much for Japanese Americans. Yeah.
So I'm going to take us back in time to when you were leaving, the photo you showed us of you leaving Jerome to go to Gila River. Do you have any memories of that trip?
Not really.
Okay.
I just remember that. Whoops, let me reach for a couple of more pictures here. So when we were in Jerome, here's just a few pictures, you know, that, you know, my mom was really good at making albums, and told you she was very much organized. But here's some pictures of us in camp.
Where did she get a camera, or who took these photographs?
You know, I heard that they were not allowing cameras when they first were, but I think people snuck them in, especially some professional photographers that, hey, I gotta have my camera. Plus, I think they opened things up so that people were ordering through Montgomery Ward and Sears Roebuck, and, you know.
And these albums you're showing us, did your mother create them while she was in camp? Do you know?
I would guess she had just photographs that she collected and made the albums after camp. But, you know, you were showing me those documents about my dad's baseball career.
Yes.
But in camp, he was a little bit older, but this is a baseball team. And there's my dad right there. Another picture here, there's my dad. One was in Jerome. I think this one here was the Fresno Assembly Center. But it's interesting that Florin, the community, had, you know, baseball teams, so somehow they were sneaking baseball uniforms into the camps.
That's really neat.
Yeah.
Why do you think baseball was important to your dad?
I just think the fact that he played in high school, and it became a very popular thing where Lodi, Stockton, Sacramento, Placer, all the areas had their own baseball teams. And it was the all-American sport. So I always think again that, you know, we were really Americanized. And so that's kind of the tragedy of, you know, Americans American citizens being deprived of their, without due process of law, you know, and just was not a good thing.
What other things did your father do besides baseball while incarcerated? What are some of the things that he did with his time or as his job?
Well, you were showing me those, you know, things that his name popped up as far as activities. So he was a block manager in Jerome, I know, and he was involved in the sports programs. I think it's some things you showed me. He was part of a task force on woodworking. I mean, that was not his area, but somehow he was getting involved in community activities in camp. Yeah.
And one of the things we looked at was that photograph that you also had of him going to Seabrook Farms.
Right.
Could you talk, what do you know about what he was doing, like what his job was with that? Yeah,
so he was, again, I think the fact that he had that business background and had fairly good communication skills, you know, maybe relative to Japanese at the time. And so he was recruiting workers for Seabrook Farms from the various camps. So I think he had a visa where he could travel to other camps and recruit people. And so he was kind of a manager of personnel or recruiting. Yeah.
How did your mom spend her days in camp?
Well, you know, I just think about that. And Mary Tsukamoto's book mentions that my mom, with 5 kids, not having the washing machine she had here in Florin, washing clothes by hand with a scrub board. She pretty much took care of her younger sister, who was not real well, and did, I think, the laundry for her mother and father even. So I think it was really tough for all women to do just the household chores without having the washing machines and ironing boards or whatever, and just so it was. I guess the only salvation was you didn't have to cook because they had a mess hall with cooks, for prepare. So food preparation was not the best food, but at least it was prepared.
What memories do you have of food in the camps?
I don't have that much. My oldest brother always complained about food and the fact that he didn't enjoy a single day of camp because he was junior high, early high school age. And I think he remembered Florin, Elk Grove, Sacramento. He remembered the outside. I was fortunate being that young. Like I say, I don't remember. So I don't remember missing anything. But he was missing things from the outside. So that age difference was beneficial for me.
Did you begin going to school while you were in camp?
Started kindergarten. And then the first and second grades I finished in camp, and then started third grade at the Florin Grammar School.
How do you think your education was behind barbed wire?
I don't remember a whole lot about school, but I don't think, I was looking at some of the old annuals of the camps, and we had Japanese American teachers, but a lot of Caucasian people came in that were teachers. And when I was in Arkansas, I remember talking to some Arkansas people, natives there, and they said, you know what, we were a little bit ticked off that some of the, because it was in rural Arkansas, they said some federal government was paying more than our local school districts. So they were picking some of the best teachers we had in our district for the camps. So I don't think I suffered, because we had the education, and starting the third grade in Florin, I don't remember missing a beat. I did well in grammar school, and so I don't think there was any nothing that really hurt us from our camp. But again, I think about other people, like my wife's aunt was a sophomore at UC Berkeley. She never finished college because 3.5 years. So depending on what level you were at, it could have been a real spike in your life if you, say, couldn't graduate from college that you would have otherwise had done.
Yeah, absolutely. Or you could lose your whole business like your
Right.
dad did. Yeah. Something that you had mentioned briefly earlier was watching movies on a mountain, and I was wondering if you could explain to me what that means and what that would have looked like for those of us that have never been to Gila River, Arizona.
At least it was real hot, desert country, so we took our blankets and maybe some water, so we used to watch on the side of the mountain, and so it was enjoyable, but not as nice as being in a theater with a soft seat and a big screen, and but like I showed you in my list of movies there, I've always loved movies. And I guess it started even with the camp years, but that wasn't detrimental as far as hurting my movie life.
Was there a screen?
Yeah, a screen at the bottom of the hill.
And you would sit on the hill
Right.
looking down at the screen?
Yeah.
Stadium seating.
Stadium
Right.
seating at
Yeah.
Gila River. Who knew?
Yeah.
What was the climate like? What memories do you have of the climate at Gila River?
I just remember how hot it was. And I mentioned that thing about standing in line for that ice cream cone and when that truck rolled in for one time. Yeah. So it was really hot. Yeah.
Sarah, do you have Gila questions?
No.
Okay. Are there things about Gila River that you remember that I haven't asked you about? I know you don't have a ton of memories from this time, but was there anything that we haven't talked about that you'd like to share from Gila?
I just, again, I was 8 when I got out, so not a whole lot. But I remember going to baseball games.
Oh, tell me about those.
Yeah, and you know, again, it was very popular even before camp, but then they continued that in the camps. So they had a whole bunch of teams by area. So we had a Florin team, like I showed in that picture there. So somehow the Florin people were kind of moved together for the most part. So maybe they had a Lodi team from another part of the camp, and they were very competitive. And actually, they had a few games against other public schools outside the camps. Yeah. So I remember in Arizona we played against Mesa High School, and so it was so baseball. I remember. What else? I can't remember. I just remember my uncle made turtle soup one time, and
Wait, what is turtle soup?
I don't know, but he got a turtle someplace and he made a soup out of it. And, I didn't like it, but.
Did you get to watch your dad play on the same team as Kenichi Zenimura?
No, because my dad, by the time he went to camp, you know, he already had 5 kids.
Yeah,
And he was a manager. He was a manager of the teams, but I still remember that Zenimura name. Yeah.
Yeah, he's a famous baseball player, and there he was in the same place where you were watching baseball games.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So I think I remember the name Zenimura being spoken in camp.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Were there other sports that you watched besides baseball?
I'm not sure if they had gymnasiums. They had a big assembly hall for, you know, high school gatherings or more, but I don't remember basketball as much as baseball. And baseball diamonds were probably just prepared by the people.
What did you do for fun as a child in Gila River besides watch baseball? Were there games that you played?
Again, the movie, you know.
Yeah. Okay.
Like my oldest brother, he was high school age, so he learned to dance. They used to have dances. So the guys and gals that were of high school age, or you know, around that age, a lot of them were good dancers. They did the jitterbug, the waltz, the tango, all those dances. They were pretty good dancers. That was one of the few activities. Yeah.
What do you remember about the military police?
I just remember the towers and the presence of military police, but other than that, I guess there was just one incident of a Japanese guy that was killed by a sentry. Yeah, only one instance, yeah.
And then something I haven't asked you about yet are the latrines. What do you remember of the latrine buildings?
You know, I'm glad you brought that up because I was going to talk about this. But when I speak at the museum, I said, I remember going into the U.S. Air Force and the first time going to those latrines that are just open banks and no privacy. But guys, it's not quite as hard to take as for women to lose that privacy. So I always tell the classes that come to the museum that my sister and my cousins, ladies, they used to tell me about when they went to the bathroom, they all had their own paper bags. And they would wear these bags over their heads when they went to the bathroom. So it was a way of getting privacy by people not being able to identify who you are. But it's kind of a sad commentary to have to wear a bag over your head to go to the bathroom.
Yeah. Wow.
And I think I showed you this picture of Pedro before, didn't I?
You did, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And one thing about the 442nd, again, there's some concluding remarks, is that, you know, there have been, I'm glad, coverage that acknowledged the 442nd's record. This one book I bought, it's pretty banged up now, but it's a history of the 442nd. Mm-hmm. It's got the name of every member of the 442nd. Here's another book, Go for Broke, and it shows a picture of a 442nd guy with captured German soldiers. They made a movie called, by that title, Go for Broke. starring Van Johnson, who was one of the big stars of that day. So there's been at least the acknowledgement and some recognition of the fact that these guys had a hell of a battle record.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, there absolutely has. There's some very important books that have come out on that topic.
Okay, and I got all these things out that you said you asked about pictures, but this is the interesting thing that, remember I told you that leaving Jerome, there's a picture of, I'm in the middle there, but our truck leaving, and probably a school teacher or somebody saying goodbye to us. Here's another one with my dad, same truck, saying goodbye to maybe some administrator at the camp.
That's your dad standing on the ground.
Yeah.
Yeah, uh-huh.
Another picture here. And that's why I was wondering, why do we get into so many pictures, but there's truck number 1 we were in.
Wow. So are those trucks taking you to the train
Train
station?
people, yeah.
In McGee, Arkansas?
I think it was McGee. I went to McGee when we went to Arkansas. Yeah.
Wow. Do you remember leaving Gila River? You talked about the bus coming into Florin. Do you remember what it felt like to leave Gila for the first time?
No, but that's the only thing I remember, hitting that Florin Road
Yeah.
with the Greyhound.
Yeah, it's a very powerful memory. What did your parents do when they got back to Florin? How did they get back on their feet?
You know, when we first arrived, I think maybe the renters that Mary Macomber had gotten were still in our house. So I think there were about 35 people living at the Tsukamoto house. And we were fortunate that the Tsukamoto house was available, because a lot of Japanese had lost their homes. So both the Methodist Church Hall and the Buddhist Church Hall were just filled with Japanese people who had no place to go. Yeah.
Had your family stored any items during the duration of the incarceration?
I'm not sure, because, you know, my dad just sold all his trucks because he didn't know when he was going to get back. My uncle, who had a grocery store in Florin, he stored his grocery goods in a big warehouse. When he never came back to Florin, he resettled in Michigan. And the federal government sent all the food that he had stored in this warehouse to Michigan. And most of it was unusable, with almost 4 years of time had passed. And I think about, again, my uncle in Michigan too. You know, talk about disruption of your life. He became a landscaper and gardener in Michigan. So he did okay. But every winter when there's no gardening to do, or, you know, it just snow in Michigan, he would come back and spend a couple of months here. And he said, this is home. But by then his kids had married in Michigan, and they were kind of the backbone for the family, so he could not leave his kids. But what a change in his life because of the internment.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And which uncle is this?
This is, he's the one that was married to my mom's older sister.
Okay, what was his name?
Charlie Ogata. Yeah.
And he got stuck in Michigan.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You said that your father restarted his business as best he could. And you had mentioned that he just had a beat up old truck, and then he got another one eventually. Yeah. How much was he able to grow his business past that?
So I think he started with like 2.
Yeah.
I think he built it up to maybe 10 trucks, but only half of what he had before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he was reliant on the farms in the area. And
right.
So many of those had been lost.
Right.
What was the community of Florin like after the incarceration, after that huge interruption in people's lives? Was the community able to get back on its feet?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm not sure what the percentage of people who returned. I've heard some people say like 60%. But a lot of people who came back, if they came back, maybe they had a home, but they had lost a part of their farm or whatever, or the crops had died or whatever. And so a lot of people started working outside. So still, like 60% was still a lot of people. So the Buddhist church and the Christian church were both still active, and there were community activities. Still had a baseball team for Florin. So I think it went on, but it was not like pre-war. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's a big thing getting in the way of a successful community.
Right.
Did your family have any savings that they were able to keep through the course of the war?
I think my dad probably had some savings. I was telling you, he did pretty well. And then having his home again, and being able to start the business that was not as good as before, but he was able to make a living. But I still remember when I went out to college, and he told me once, I'm sorry I couldn't have helped you out more in college. But, my brothers and sister, we all went through college. And in those days, if you got a summer job and got a part-time job on campus or something, you could kind of make it through, not like today.
Yeah.
So we were able to all, graduate from college. And so I told my dad, hey, don't worry about that. I mean, we made it through. Yeah.
Did your grandparents on the Tsukamoto side, what happened to them after camp?
So that Tsukamoto farm was still there. So Uncle Al ran the farm, but my grandparents still were helping with drying persimmons or putting the packaging the grapes or, picking strawberries. So they continued to work as, like farm laborers for their son.
For how long? How long did they live past the war?
I'm not sure. My grandfather lived to be, I think, 98, and my grandmother 92 or something. So they had, substantial life yet after camp. Yeah.
When the law changed to allow Issei to naturalize as U.S. citizens, did either of them did they do that?
They tried. Good question, because, in 1952, they authorized Asians to become citizens again, but you had to pass a test. So they had to learn about the Constitution, the offices in the U.S. government, how many are in the Senate, the Assembly, or House of Representatives, or whatever. So they tried, but they gave up.
It's a lot of work. Yeah, a lot of people who get American citizenship just by being born would probably struggle with those tests.
But what was interesting, I think about my grandparents, they listened to the Sacramento Solon baseball game every night on the radio. And we went to some games too. But they loved baseball, so they could understand balls and strikes and what inning you're in and all that. So they used to listen to this radio broadcasts of the Sacramento Solons every night. And they loved American movies. So a lot of it, the Earl Flynn swashbucklers or Westerns, there's not a whole lot you need to understand as far as the dialogue. So they really enjoyed American movies, yeah.
Did you get to know your grandparents very well?
To the extent that they spoke only Japanese, but we had, they lived just close to us, and we had gatherings just about every week, yeah.
Would you be able to tell us like how I asked with your parents, would you be able to tell us what your grandma and grandpa's personalities were like?
I was telling you about my grandfather being very quiet and, just the fact that he didn't speak English. I mean, there's not much communication. But like I told you, he was a very quiet man, except that one time I poured the water over his head. And
could you tell us that on tape? I think that was when we were sitting over at the table.
Okay. So my grandfather was a very quiet man. So had very little, dialogue with him. But we were cleaning out the water pump on the farm. and there was a drain pipe that was outlet that was at the maybe about 6 inches from the bottom of the tank. So we could drain the rest of it through the spout on the drain pipe. But when we got to the bottom, we had to bucket the rest of the water. So my uncle's passing the water over the top of the tank, and then I would throw it over the side of the ledge there. So my grandfather comes out, and I poured the whole bucket of water on him. And that's the only time I had some dialogue with him. His dialogue with me was swearing in Japanese, I guess it was. And but to top it off, maybe 3 minutes later, I got another bucket. And guess what? He comes underneath again. And I poured the second bucket right over his head. He was irate.
Did you get to learn some Japanese swear words that day? What about your grandma? What was her personality like?
Again, no dialogue, but she was, a nice, quiet lady. Yeah.
When we did an oral history with your cousin Marielle,
Yeah.
she said that she really grew up with your family. Were there other cousins that were sort of part of the extended family that you were close to?
So my father's next younger brother was in Sacramento. He ran a noodle factory. But my brother right below me and I, we used to go and spend the weekend a lot in Sacramento. And they lived near K Street, which is the main street. So we would go see movies a lot, go see the baseball team by walking maybe 10 blocks to the ballpark. But so we did a lot of activities with them too. But the Tsukamotos, they live, just half a mile from us. So we did a lot of things together, camping, vacations. Yeah, so we did a lot of things. Yeah, so I kind of really have fond memories of relatives.
Yeah. Sarah, is there any questions you have?
No, but just watch out to.
Oh, okay.
I was really thinking ahead.
It's okay.
Just at that time.
Could you tell me what year you graduated from high school?
1955.
Okay. And where did you go from there?
I went to Sacramento Junior College, and then from Sacramento Junior College to Berkeley.
Okay. And earlier you told us you knew exactly what you wanted to study. Was that something you knew all along, that you wanted to go into accounting, or how did you come to that?
Well, I was always pretty good with numbers. And I remember in high school, I got an A+ in algebra. And I remember getting a Bank of America certificate as a top math student in my graduating class. So numbers were kind of, where I thought I excelled in. But I still reflect back, and my career in government with the State Department of Finance was a very good job. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the people. I was pretty good at it, everything. But my wife Caroline's good friend told me when I was at Berkeley, "Hey, Les, you ought to be in the arts." And I reflect back on that, and I said, it wouldn't have been bad, because I have friends who are landscape architects, and I kind of look back and I say, you know what? I think I'm as much interested in landscaping, even architecture of homes and things, and I have a kind of an artistic bent that I could very well have been very happy with a major in something like architecture or landscaping. And I look at my friends who are in those professions. Sometimes I kind of look and say, I think I have as much interest in arts as they do.
Yes, and after seeing your incredible garden in the backyard, I think perhaps you have as much talent as well. Yeah.
And I have a good friend who, she has a twin sister, and her sister's in landscape architecture. And she, like me, we worked in government finance. So I just wrote an email to her the other day saying, hey, how come you didn't, with a twin sister that went into landscaping, why didn't you, and she said, well, my sister had some kind of a connection with horticulture, or she did some kind of a seminar with landscaping, so that got her into it. Whereas I didn't have that exposure. But I told her, hey, we both had nice careers, and so we enjoy landscaping our homes and things now. Yeah. So.
What year did you graduate from Berkeley?
1960.
Okay. And I understand you had some military service.
Right.
Could you tell me about that? Was that
Getting
something
back
you
to
chose?
Getting back to Berkeley,
Sure.
I got 2 degrees. I graduated in 60 and summer of 62 after I returned from the Air Force. So I have 2 degrees, one in biostatistics. So it's statistics related to health, and then the other one's accounting. Yeah. Okay, now get to the question about the Air Force. So 1961, I joined the Air Force Reserve Program, just 6 months of active duty, and then 5.5 years of summer camp and monthly meetings. So I fulfilled so I'm really glad that I had some military experience, because I actually enjoyed basic training, with the sergeants yell at you and everything. But hey, after all these years of college, hey, I was running every day with calisthenics and even enjoying the Air Force food, because you're so hungry by the time you work out. And I still remember in basic training, I was the shortest guy in our platoon. So the sergeant knew me right away by name. I got chewed out more than anybody else in the whole unit, and he came up to me one day and said, "Hey, Ochita, I apologize, but I got to pick on people to make an example of, and chew people out. So I just know you, so thanks a lot."
Lucky you.
Right.
Now, did you volunteer, or were you you volunteered?
I volunteered.
Okay, what made you want to do that?
When my Uncle Pedro, who saw that action with the 442nd in World War II, he told my oldest brother when he was a candidate for the draft during the Korean War, he told Ken, "Don't get drafted. You don't want to go into the infantry and fight on the ground." So my brother volunteered for the Air Force. So when my time came up and it was more the Vietnam War, I remembered those words and I said, I'm not going to get drafted. So I volunteered for the Air Force.
So your Uncle Pedro, he had a lot of experience to be able to give you that wisdom ahead of time. Yeah. Did your brother see combat action during the Korean War?
No, because he was in the Air Force and just stationed in the States. I know one of his high school classmates got killed in Korea. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of lives lost there.
Yeah.
When you were in the military or high school or college, did you face any prejudice for being Japanese American?
Good question, because for the most part, not. But I remember there was one kid from Georgia, the South, and he would give me some words, gook or, Jap or whatever. And there were 2 guys that I got along with very well. They were both Californians. And they overheard one comment. And they came up to me and said, "Hey, what did that guy say to you?" And I said, "Oh, forget it, but he just called me a gook or something." And they said, "Hey, we'll take care of him." But I said, "No, forget it. He's not worth it." But it doesn't bother me that much, because he's kind of showing his level of character. But just the fact that it happened, and then a couple of guys stood up for me, that I really appreciate that.
When you were in school, did any of your classes, I know you like history, you've said it a few times, did any of your classes ever talk about what had happened to you and your family and the entire West Coast Japanese American community?
No.
What did you think about that? Having lived through this history that we now think of as important, that it wasn't taught for such a long time.
Yeah, that was one of the things that was often mentioned, that it should be taught more often in history books or whatever. But I think maybe it's because of the civil rights movement of the 60s and people becoming more aware of prejudice towards the Muslims, or it's kind of arisen, and there has been enough, like the California Museum, they have that permanent display, and then we have the program for the time of remembrance, they call it. So I think, and even some Japanese, I think, refrain from, they said, no, that's past history. But in a way, I feel it's a little bit important that it is a unique part of our history. And when I talk to the kids, I often kind of conclude my presentation with the fact that, you kids went down to the courtyard and you saw that big wall that they call the Constitution Wall. And on the wall are a lot of words that deal with democracy and the Constitution, and some of the words, like the word speak is up there very prominently. And so this Chuck Kobayashi, he's a lawyer and a judge that used to do presentations too, but Chuck used to tell the class when they went down there, see that word speak? That's a very important word for you as citizens to exercise your freedom of speech with a good intent, and that doesn't mean you speak up and yell fire in a crowded theater. But it does mean that maybe you as a kid, even at your age, you see something unjustified, like someone being bullied on the playgrounds. Go speak up. So I always kind of tell that story and say that. So this class today was mainly about Japanese Americans and our internment experience. But really the lesson for today is, hey, we got to all be good citizens. Yeah.
Well, I guess I won't make a segue into this. I'm curious if you were involved in any way in the redress movement that started in the 1970s and 80s.
Okay, I was not that involved. I was supporting it because I thought it was something that could be rectified, and so the Japanese community had a kind of a mass letter writing campaign to President Reagan. And I looked at the form letter and I said, okay, if I just sign off on the letter, it adds to the numbers. But instead, I decided to write a handwritten letter to Nancy Reagan. Never heard a thing about it, but I just thought it would be more effective if somehow maybe Nancy would hand it to President Reagan saying, hey, I got this letter. So in the gist of the letter was what happened to my family, and I think it was not a nice thing for our nation to do. So I wish your husband would sign this reparations bill. But I always think about what happened to that letter.
That's pretty smart, going in through his wife. Maybe you knew where the real power was. Were you aware of any of the redress hearings that were taking place on the West Coast or anywhere in the country?
I knew about them, and then like my Aunt Mary, she went and spoke before that committee. Daniel Inouye, he made a recommendation when the Japanese community was thinking about how do we approach this thing as far as reparations. And a lot of people were advocating a bill be introduced in Congress. And Dan Inouye said a more effective approach might be if Congress would form a committee to study it. And that's when the hearings began and all that. But that was a very smart move on Danny Inouye's part to say, let's try to get a committee. So when that committee completed their study, they came out with the conclusion that the internment took place because of 3 reasons: war hysteria, racial prejudice, and lack of political leadership. 3 things. And they recommended monetary reparation even, and an apology. So then with that committee recommendation, the bill passed. And it was very fortunate because Bob Matsui, House of Representatives, he's a good friend of mine, Bob. And I remember Bob saying, hey, Les, I don't think there's a snowball's chance in hell that we're going to get this bill passed. But with that, all that happening, the grassroots thing, and Bob said that one of the things he told me was that this Southern House of Representative official came up to him one day and said, hey, Bob, you know, we're good friends. I know you and your wife Doris and my wife get along well. We go to dinners together. But I just can't support the reparations bill because my constituents in the South don't care about giving money to, you know, a few Japanese Americans. And then Bob said, you know what, Les, one day this guy walks up to me and said, I'm going to be a co-author on the bill. And he said, it wasn't because of you, Bob. It was because of a 442nd vet walking into my office and telling me the story and why I should support the bill. So I found that to be really an interesting, yeah.
Yeah, a lot of those veteran stories had real big impacts.
Yeah, yeah.
How did you feel when you got that apology letter and the monetary reparation?
I think it was a good feeling because a nation admits a wrong, and it really was an injustice where, you know, I think about my mom and dad who didn't get the reparations, but you know, it really hurt their lives, and I'm kind of proud of the fact that Japanese Americans behaved and were good citizens in spite of, you know, how we were treated. So, you know, that was 1942, a different time. If it happened today, Japanese Americans wouldn't put up with it. But it was a different time, and people said, we're just going to be good citizens and abide by the president's executive order. Recently, I kept this Sacramento Bee. This was February 21st, 2020, so only 2 years ago. But on the front page, there's a picture here. I'm in the picture there. But it says, making amends for 1942.
If you hold it back closer,
Okay.
if you lean back, it'll be in the light and it might show up a
okay.
little better. Yeah.
Making amends for 1942.
Yeah, and what was going on there? What was going on in that photograph?
So I'll just read a little caption here. It says, Assemblyman so-and-so joins Japanese Americans who were incarcerated during World War II. After the California Assembly passed a resolution at the state capitol in support of the internment. So this bill passed one day after the anniversary. So like 70 years later, the California legislature apologized for having done something wrong. Mm-hmm. So I just think about, you know, and I've mentioned this before, that at least we're a country that can apologize even if it takes some time. Hey, if you can say you did it wrong, that's, you know, it's a hard thing to apologize for anything, but if you admit you're wrong, that's a good thing, yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I'm curious what you thought, your Aunt Mary wrote a book that went on to be pretty well known. I know it really influenced the exhibits that we have at Manzanar National Historic Site.
Yeah.
What did you think when she wrote out her family story and published it in that book?
Well, you know, she was a real activist. And I still think about Mary having been a college graduate and picking strawberries as her career with a college degree. And we had a principal at the Florin Grammar School called Isabel Jackson. And Isabel found out about Mary having a degree. And she said, Mary, why don't you go to Sac State and get your teaching credentials? So she thought about it, and you know, she was a choir leader, a church activist, real strong Christian, and you know, just the way she was, very articulate. So in a way, when she came out with a book, I wasn't that surprised, because she was a historian, and yeah.
Something that we didn't talk about, though we saw her earlier when she came in, is at some point you were married. Would you want to tell us anything about your wife, or maybe just her name?
Well, her name's Caroline, and we met at Berkeley when both of us got part-time jobs to finance her finish school. So.
And what year did you two get married? Uh-oh, it's a test on camera.
Right. What was it, 67, I think? Yeah.
Do you have children?
2 boys. Yeah.
Did you talk to your kids about Jerome and Gila River when they were growing up?
Some, but not a whole lot. But, you know, 2 years ago, I'm a great big football fan. So Cal Berkeley's my team. And so Cal was playing University of Mississippi in 2020. So I told my 2 sons, hey, let's go to New Orleans we'll spend about 5 days there, and then we'll drive to Mississippi. And then we went to the game, and then we drove to Memphis, Tennessee, where they had a Martin Luther King museum there. So it was the nicest trip. But between New Orleans and going to Mississippi, I showed the kids a map of Jerome, Arkansas, where we were interned for 2 years. So they wanted to see it too. So we drove to the, you know, the intern. And there wasn't a lot, not like Manzanar, but at least we saw the site of Jerome and Rower there. And then we went to the town of Magee, and they had a museum of the internment there in the little town of Magee. So I had them exposed to that. And and that's why I kind of wanted to do that memoir thing, because it's addressed to Ryan and Russell, but to give them a little background of, and I included comments about, you know, our camp life too. So.
Yeah, why is it important to you to pass these stories down in your family?
You know, I think it's kind of my nature to, maybe sometimes I'm too nostalgic about things, and I like history a lot. I'm like my mother, I make photograph albums. You know, I do the Christmas tree decoration because I like that. But so with all of that, I think it's just that kind of my nature that I want to pass things on and cherish good times, you know.
Well, I know that many generations down the line, they're going to be real happy that you did that and that you recorded your stories like this. You know, I only have a few more questions, but I want to know if there's anything we've missed that is important to you that we record on this.
The one thing, getting back to the interment and the redress.
Yes.
I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, maybe you are, but Against All Odds.
Oh, yes.
Have you read that?
Yes.
It's a real good Harvard paper written by a couple of Harvard students, and it's got the real good capturing of the redress effort. And I guess the title, Against All Odds, is just like Bob Matsui was saying, hey, it doesn't have a snowball's chance in hell, but it really was against all odds. And the effort that people went through, and it was really fortunate that Congress, at the time of that movement, we had 5 Japanese Americans in Congress. That was an awful big help, and yeah.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that resource up. You said you went to a number of the camps. I think, could you tell me how many you've been to?
7.
And which ones are those, if you don't mind me asking?
So I've been to Jerome and Rower, and Gila and Poston. Then the 2 in California are Manzanar and Tule Lake. So that's 6. The 7th one was Topaz, where my wife was born.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh,
So
interesting.
the 3 I haven't been to are Minidoka in Idaho, Heart Mountain in Wyoming, and what's the last one? Well, Amachi in Colorado.
Yeah, yeah,
So I've been to 7 of them, yeah.
yeah. Why have you made the effort to visit so many of them?
Again, I think it's kind of my nature to
Okay.
visit something that might have been part of my life, or or part of people's lives that I know.
Yeah. And then you mentioned earlier you went to that really big reunion that was the Jerome Rower
Right.
reunion. Could you tell us about that for those of us who weren't there?
Okay, so I've got a DVD of it that they sent to all the attendees, but I think we had, a really large crowd, maybe 4,000 people or something that went to that. And the keynote speaker was to be Clinton. He was president at the time. And he thought, because it was in Arkansas, and that's his home state, he was going to be the keynote speaker. Then he had surgery, I think just a couple of weeks before that, so he had to back out of that. So the keynote speaker in his place was, I think, Daniel Inouye. And Daniel Inouye did a good job of being a speaker. And one of the stories that Dan told, which I found really interesting, and I might have heard it before too, but when the 442nd, I told you the 100th Battalion was formed with just Hawaiian boys. And when they came to train, and then they were merged into the 442nd after they had fought in Italy, the Hawaiian boys and the mainland guys did not get along. I don't know if you guys have heard about the fact that there's a difference in the culture. I think part of it is our mainlanders, we're the minority, and we've always kind of stood aside. The guys from Hawaii's population was 40% Japanese American. They were the majority, because when you mix the Filipinos and the whites and the Polynesians and everything, 40% was more than it was the largest majority. So the Hawaiians they didn't have the feeling of being the minority where you have to watch your step. So they were a lot looser, and I've seen that with Hawaiian guys that came to Berkeley even to go to school. Their personalities were a little different. So when they went to train with the mainland guys in Mississippi, there was a real conflict, fist fights. They were not getting along. And Dan Inouye said, this couldn't go on. And he said, some officer for the whole regiment said, yeah, this can't go on. So he got a couple of buses full and loaded it with just Hawaiian boys, drove them to Jerome and Rower. And the guys, seeing all the people that looked like them behind barbed wire, and the Japanese ladies made rice balls for them and Spam and some things that they knew Japanese guys would like. And he said that really changed the feelings of Hawaiian boys towards the mainland Japanese Americans. So that was kind of a neat story that he told, yeah.
Wow. Yeah. That must have been very shocking for them
Yeah.
to see that.
And then another thing I think about is maybe you had it in one of the questions. How did the internment affect us? You know, like when I went to junior college, we had even in high school, we kind of our closest friends, with some exceptions, but were the Japanese people, and they went to Sacramento Junior College. We had dances, and the Japanese American Student Club would have dances, and we even segregated ourselves from the Chinese, even, you know. So we were very much Japanese oriented. They went to Berkeley. It was kind of the same thing, and I stayed at that Euclid Hall. That it was a Japanese alumni-owned dormitory. So even Bob Matsui, who stayed there too, he said, you know, he became a lawyer, and he said having that Berkeley experience where we still stayed within our Japanese American community, then all of a sudden I'm an attorney in Sacramento, and trying to get yourself involved in the whole community was a little bit tough being Japanese American. And then another story I like to tell people is that I still remember when I was working at the Department of Finance, a co-worker of mine came up to me one day and said, "Hey, Les, we just interviewed a Japanese American for a position we have open." And we were describing the duties to him, and his response was, "I don't think I'm capable of doing it." And he said, "Hey, you're supposed to be selling yourself when you're interviewing." And this guy was saying, he's apologetic and saying, "I can't do it," you know. He says, "What's going on here?" And I said, "Hey, Bill, you know, I can understand that, because part of our culture was never be boastful, don't talk religion and politics or things that, you know, might offend anybody." So it was that kind of thing of not being, selling yourself, you know. So I said, I can understand that. And this guy was probably would have been a good worker, but they couldn't hire him because the panel just said, "Hey, this guy's not." But that was kind of a reflection, I think, of a lot of Japanese. I think about what we lost as far as being interned. First of all, we've lost our freedom and we're locked up. Second, financially, you know, people like my dad lost a lot of money. But thirdly, I think there was a little bit of that self-respect or self-image that was diminished somewhat when you were put away and you were called names when you got out. So there was kind of a diminishing or a psychological impact on us that wasn't the best. And I think it's, you know, over time it's really changed. And I often think now, I look at, go to anybody's house, Japanese American home, and you look at the family pictures, hey, it's a mix of people. And I think if a Caucasian person brought home a prospective spouse that's Japanese American, hey, it won't be that much of a problem. So time heals, you know.
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. That was the next one I was going to, or
Oh.
answering it before I even asked it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
I think I
thank
saw
you
it.
so much.
that
Yeah.
was perfect.
I only have one more question for you, unless do you have anything, Sarah? So, Les, we, as you know, we work at a site that teaches Japanese American incarceration history at Manzanar.
Uh-huh.
But there's also a museum that teaches Jerome and Rower's history.
Okay.
And many, many, many people come and visit these places every year. We get about 115,000
Wow.
a year. And what I want to know from you is what you hope we teach them, and what lesson you hope they come away with when they learn about the stories of families like your own.
You know, like I was telling you, I give that talk at the museum, and I tell the people that I'm kind of proud of the way the Japanese Americans, like my parents, you know, the way they conducted themselves. The guys who fought for our country. My uncle, his wife is behind barbed wire, and he's fighting for the American, you know, army. So it's really something that was not right. But even when things are not the best, you can still be a good citizen. And I think that's the lesson that we could learn from something that was not right. But you can still learn from it and be a better citizen. You know, that's kind of the, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Les. It's been an absolute pleasure to get to sit here and listen to your stories, and also to see all of the photographs that you prepared ahead of time to show to us. Thank you so much. I wasn't expecting that, and it was a very good surprise.
Well, when you mentioned the photos, I said, geez, I got a lot of photos,
Yes,
so
you
I'm
do.
gonna try to organize it so I could.
Yeah. Yeah, so on behalf of myself and Sarah and Mans and our National Historic Site, where we're going to preserve and share this story, and also on behalf of, you know, people 100 years from now who can listen to this, thank you very
Yeah.
much.
So it's going to be on YouTube?
Someday it's going to
Someday.
be up on the internet, yes. Yeah, thank you, Les.
Yeah. So someday if it's on, let me know.
We will.
Okay.